heard the microphone crackle to life and my heart dropped straight through the floor when I saw my husband Frank standing up at our son Michael's wedding reception with that look on his face. You know the one, honey. That cold, determined look that means somebody's about to get their world turned upside down. What he said next, in front of 200 guests, made my 42 years of marriage crumble like stale wedding cake right there at the Marriott in downtown Atlanta. "I have an announcement to make," Frank said, his voice carrying across that beautiful reception hall where our son Michael had just married his college sweetheart, Sarah. The DJ stopped the music. Conversations died mid-sentence, and every single soul in that room turned to look at my husband of 40 decades. I was sitting at the head table in my pale blue mother of the groom dress that I'd spent 3 months picking out, watching my husband destroy everything we built together with 5 simple words. "Dorothy and I are getting divorced." Y'all, I couldn't breathe. I literally could not draw air into my lungs. The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with the wedding cake knife. Our son Michael's face went white as his bride's dress. Sarah's mother gasped so loud it echoed, and I felt 200 pairs of eyes turn from Frank to me like I was some kind of spectacle at a county fair. My hands started shaking so bad I had to grip the tablecloth to steady myself. And honey, I let out the longest breath you ever heard because I just knew this was only the beginning of whatever nightmare my husband was about to put me through. But Frank wasn't done. Oh, no, sweetie, he was just getting started. I've been seeing someone else for the past 18 months. Her name is Linda. She works at my dentist office, and we're moving in together next week. The microphone picked up every single word, broadcasting my humiliation to everyone who mattered in our lives. Our children, our grandchildren, our church family, my book club ladies, Frank's golf buddies, everybody we'd known for decades. I found myself whispering like someone might overhear, even though the whole room had already heard everything. "Frank, what are you doing?" But my voice came out so small and broken that I don't think anyone heard me, except maybe my daughter Jessica, who was sitting right next to me with tears already streaming down her cheeks. The words felt like glass in my throat, and I could feel all the air leaving my lungs at once as I realized that my husband, my partner, my best friend for 42 years, had just announced to our entire family and social circle that he'd been cheating on me for a year and a half. You know what, honey? I stopped talking for a hot minute because my brain just couldn't process what was happening. This was supposed to be Michael's day, the happiest day of our son's life, and Frank had just turned it into the worst day of mine. The silence stretched between us like a canyon, and I could hear people starting to whisper, chairs scraping against the floor as guests shifted uncomfortably, and somewhere in the back of the room, I heard Frank's sister Margaret say, "Oh my Lord," under her breath. Before I tell you what happened next, and honey, this part is going to absolutely shock you. If you're loving this story, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. You know I get so excited when I see y'all in the comments. Speaking of which, what state are you calling home right now? Drop it down below. And sweetie, tell me, have you ever had family blindside you in front of everyone you know? Because your stories help me know I'm not alone in this crazy world. Now, let me tell you what I discovered next, because what Frank thought was going to be his moment of freedom was about to backfire in the most beautiful way. See, what my cheating husband didn't know was that I've been having my suspicions for months. You don't live with someone for 42 years without noticing when they start showering twice a day, wearing cologne to run errands, and coming home from the dentist with perfectly clean teeth and a smile that looked like the cat who ate the canamari. I'd even hired a private investigator, a sweet young woman named Amanda, who charged me $200 to follow Frank around for a week and take pictures that confirmed what my heart already knew. But here's the thing, y'all. I hadn't decided what to do with that information yet. I was still processing, still trying to figure out how to salvage 42 years of marriage and protect our family from the fallout. I sure wasn't planning on finding out about my husband's infidelity through a wedding reception microphone announcement, and I definitely wasn't prepared to have my private pain turned into public entertainment for 200 guests who were supposed to be celebrating my son's new beginning. My voice broke right in half when I stood up from that head table, y'all. "Frank," I said, and I could feel those tears starting to sting behind my eyes. "This is Michael's wedding day." The microphone was still in his hand, and he was looking at me with this expression like I was inconveniencing him by being upset about his announcement. Can you believe that? Like I was the problem for not wanting our son's wedding reception to turn into our divorce announcement party. "Well, thought it was best to get it out in the open," Frank said, and honey, his voice had this defensive tone like he was actually doing me some kind of favor by humiliating me in front of everyone we'd ever known. This wasn't about honesty or transparency or doing the right thing. This was about making sure everyone knew that Frank Johnson had found himself a younger woman and was done with his old wife, Dorothy. You could hear the mischief just dancing in my voice when I reached for that microphone, y'all. "Well, then, Frank," I said, loud enough for every single guest in that Marriott reception hall to hear. "Since we're sharing news tonight, let me tell everyone about the interesting conversation I had with your brother-in-law, Pete, last week. And honey, you should have seen the color drain out of my husband's face when I said that, because Pete was married to Frank's sister, Margaret, and Pete knew all about Frank's little side business that he had been hiding from me for the past 5 years. See, what I discovered through my own investigation wasn't just that Frank was cheating, though that was certainly bad enough. No, sweetie, what I learned was that my husband had been skimming money from his contracting business and hiding it in a separate bank account that I didn't know about. We're talking about $47,000 that should have been community property, money that Frank had been squirreling away for his new life with Linda, the dental hygienist, while telling me we needed to tighten our belts and skip our annual vacation to Myrtle Beach. Pete told me all about those weekend trips to Savannah that you said were for work, the ones where you were actually house hunting with Linda using money you stole from our joint account to put deposits down on apartments. The gasps from the audience were getting louder now, and I could see Frank's girlfriend Linda. Yes, she had the absolute audacity to show up at our son's wedding as a regular guest, trying to sneak toward the exit like a roach when someone turns on the kitchen light. My voice took on this knowing, satisfied quality when I kept going. And Pete also mentioned how you've been telling everyone at the Elks Lodge that I'm the reason our marriage is falling apart, that I'm difficult and demanding, and that you deserve better after all these years. I could barely get the words out because the irony was so thick you could have served it alongside the prime rib. Here was my husband, who'd been lying and cheating and stealing from me for months, trying to paint himself as the victim of a bad marriage. Y'all, I couldn't help but let out this bitter little laugh when I saw Frank trying to take the microphone back from me. "Oh no, honey," I said, holding onto that microphone like it was a lifeline. "You open this door, now we're gonna walk through it together." The DJ had given up any pretense of trying to salvage the evening and was just standing there watching the drama unfold like everyone else in the room. Poor Michael and Sarah were holding hands at their sweetheart table, looking like they wanted to crawl under it and disappear. But I was past caring about anything except making sure Frank didn't get to control the narrative of our marriage's destruction. Frank has been having an affair with his dentist receptionist for 18 months. I announced to the crowd, my voice steady now because anger was replacing shock. But what he hasn't told y'all is that he's also been stealing money from our shared accounts to finance his new relationship. Nearly $50,000 that should have gone toward our retirement, toward helping our children with their futures, toward the grandchildren's college funds. The room was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop on that hotel carpet, and I could see people pulling out their phones to text or call someone. Probably half the city of Atlanta was going to know about Frank Johnson's betrayal before the evening was over. That's when Frank made his biggest mistake of the night, and trust me, sweetie, he'd already made some doozies. He grabbed for the microphone and said, "Dorothy, you're embarrassing yourself. Just sit down and we'll discuss this privately later.
Like I was the one causing a scene. Like he hadn't just announced our divorce to 200 wedding guests without so much as a heads-up conversation. The words came out sharper than I meant them to when I yanked that microphone back. Embarrassing myself? Embarrassing myself? Frank, you just told our entire family that you've been cheating on me for a year and a half, and you think I'm the one who should be embarrassed? You know what happened next, honey. Our son, Michael, finally found his voice. My baby boy, who'd just gotten married 3 hours earlier and should have been dancing with his new bride, walked over to the microphone and said, "Dad, what the hell is wrong with you?" And y'all, when your own child looks at you with that kind of disappointment and disgust, you know you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Michael's voice was shaking with anger when he continued, "This is my wedding day, Sarah's wedding day. How could you do this to Mom? How could you do this to us?" The silence that followed was different from the shocked silence that had greeted Frank's announcement. This was the kind of quiet that comes before a storm, when everyone in the room realizes that something fundamental has just shifted and there's no going back. Frank looked around at all those faces, our children, our friends, our extended family, and I could see him finally understanding that his plan to make a clean exit from our marriage had just blown up in his face like a faulty firework. But honey, I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. See, when you've been married to someone for 42 years, you learn things about them that they don't even know about themselves. You know their weaknesses, their fears, their secrets. And Frank had one secret that he'd been keeping from everyone, including his precious Linda. He'd been having financial problems with his contracting business for over 2 years, problems that meant he was going to need my assets to keep from filing bankruptcy. My voice was pure excitement when I grabbed that microphone one more time and said, "Oh, and Frank, before you run off into the sunset with Linda, you might want to tell her about the 3 lawsuits pending against your business, the unpaid contractor fees that are about to force you into bankruptcy, and the fact that the house she thinks you're going to share with her, it's in my name, sweetie, because I'm the one who co-signed all the loans when your credit went bad." You could hear the joy bubbling up in my voice, y'all, because finally, and I mean finally, I was getting to see Frank's face when he realized that leaving me wasn't going to be the financial fresh start he'd been planning. The color drained out of Frank's face so fast, I thought he might faint right there on the dance floor. Linda, who'd been slowly edging toward the exit, suddenly stopped dead in her tracks like she'd hit an invisible wall. Because here's what Frank had apparently forgotten to mention to his girlfriend during their romantic getaway weekends. Dorothy Johnson wasn't just some little wife house she could discard when she got tired of her. I was a co-owner of everything we'd built together, and Frank's business troubles meant he needed me a whole lot more than I needed him. "Linda, honey," I called out, my voice dripping with all that irony, "did Frank mention that he owes the IRS $37,000 in back taxes? Or that his business license is about to be revoked for those code violations? Because I've been covering those payments out of my teacher's pension for the past year, thinking I was helping my husband save the business we'd built together." Y'all could see Linda's face changing as the reality of Frank's situation sank in. She thought she was getting a successful contractor with money in the bank, but what she was actually getting was a man on the verge of financial ruin who'd been using his wife's retirement money to keep his head above water. That's when Jessica, my daughter, stood up from her seat and walked over to put her arm around me. "Mom," she said, her voice carrying across that silent reception hall, "you don't have to do this here." But honey, I looked at my beautiful daughter, then at my son Michael and his new bride Sarah, and all those faces staring at us like we were some kind of reality TV show, that Frank had made this choice for all of us when he decided to use our son's wedding as his coming out party for his affair. "Actually, sweetie," I said, my voice getting steadier with every word, I think I do need to do this here, because your father has spent 18 months lying to everyone in this room about who he is and what kind of man he's become. He's let all of you think that I'm the problem in our marriage, that I'm difficult to live with, that he deserves sympathy for being stuck with me. The words just tumbled out faster than I could think, y'all, because 42 years of being the supportive wife, the understanding partner, the woman who put everyone else's needs before her own, had just come to a screeching halt. You should have seen Frank trying to salvage the situation, honey. He walked over to me with his hands out like he was approaching a spooked horse and said, "Dorothy, let's go outside and talk about this privately. We don't need to air our problems in front of the children." And that's when I knew, I mean really knew, that my husband still didn't understand what he'd done. He thought he could control the conversation, manage the narrative, make himself look like the reasonable one while painting me as the hysterical wife who couldn't handle his announcement with dignity.
"Frank," I said, my voice so calm it probably scared him more than if I'd been screaming. "You forfeited the right to privacy when you grabbed that microphone and announced our divorce to 200 people without having the courtesy to discuss it with me first." I could feel those tears threatening to spill over, but I was determined not to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break down completely. "You want everyone to know you're leaving me for a younger woman? Fine. But they're also going to know the whole truth about why." That's when I played my final card, the one piece of information that I'd been saving in case Frank tried to take more than his fair share in a divorce settlement. And folks, since we're all being so honest tonight, let me tell you about the real reason Frank's been so eager to end our marriage. I paused for dramatic effect, looking around that room at all those expectant faces. It's not because he's in love with Linda. It's because his business is about to go under, and he knows that if we're divorced, his creditors can't come after my retirement accounts and my teacher's pension. The gasps from the audience were audible now, and I could see people's expressions changing from shock and embarrassment to something that looked like respect. Because suddenly, Frank's grand romantic gesture wasn't looking so romantic anymore. It was looking calculating and selfish and designed to protect his own interests at my expense. Linda, bless her heart, was standing near the exit looking like she'd been hit by a truck, probably realizing that her middle-aged boyfriend had painted her a very different picture of his financial situation than the reality I was laying out. Frank thought he could have his cake and eat it too, I continued, my voice taking on that satisfied quality that comes when you finally get to tell the truth after months of covering up someone else's lies. Y'all, you could hear a pin drop in that reception hall as everyone processed what I was saying, that Frank's affair wasn't just about love or midlife crisis or growing apart. It was about money and manipulation and using divorce as a financial strategy. But honey, what happened next surprised even me. Michael, my son, who'd just gotten married that very day, walked over to his father and said, "Dad, you need to leave. Now." His voice was quiet but firm, and when I looked at his face, I could see that my baby boy was done with his father's drama overshadowing his wedding day. "You've embarrassed Mom, you've embarrassed our family, and you ruined what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Take your announcement and your girlfriend and get out." Frank looked around that room like he was expecting someone to defend him, to tell Michael that he was being too harsh, to remind everyone that this was between him and me and didn't concern the kids. But what y'all saw instead was 200 faces looking at him with expressions ranging from disgust to disappointment to outright anger. His own brother Jimmy was shaking his head. His sister Margaret was crying, and his golf buddies were studying their shoes like they'd never seen anything so fascinating. "Son," Frank started, but Michael cut him off with a hand gesture that was pure authority. This was Michael's day, Michael's event, Michael's decision about who stayed and who went. "No, Dad," Michael said, his voice getting stronger. You made your choice when you decided to use my wedding reception as your platform for humiliating my mother. You could have handled this privately. You could have waited until after Sarah and I got back from our honeymoon. You could have shown some basic respect for the woman who gave you 3 children and supported your dreams for 40 decades. But instead, you chose to be cruel and selfish and calculating. My son's words were hitting their target, y'all. I could see Frank flinching with every sentence like he was being physically struck. That's when Sarah, my new daughter-in-law, who'd known our family for only 3 years, surprised everyone by walking over and hugging me tight. "Mrs. Johnson," she said, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear, "I'm so sorry this happened to you, and I'm sorry it happened at our wedding. But I want you to know that you handled yourself with more grace and dignity than most people would have in this situation." Y'all, I started crying then. Not the tears of humiliation I'd been fighting back, but tears of gratitude that this young woman who barely knew me was willing to take my side against her new father-in-law. Frank looked at his son, his new daughter-in-law, then at me, and I could see the exact moment when he realized that his plan had backfired completely. He thought he could control the narrative, make himself look like the victim of a stale marriage who'd found new love and deserved everyone's support. Instead, he'd exposed himself as a financial manipulator and emotional abuser who'd been willing to destroy his son's wedding day to serve his own selfish purposes. "This isn't how I wanted things to go," Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction now. He could see Linda near the exit, probably reconsidering her relationship with a man who just revealed himself to be broke, dishonest, and cruel to the woman who supported him for decades. He could see our children looking at him like they didn't recognize the man who'd raised them. He could see 200 wedding guests who would spend the next weeks and months talking about Frank Johnson's spectacular self-destruction at his son's reception. "How did you want things to go, Frank?" I asked, my voice steady now because I'd found my strength again. "Did you want me to smile and congratulate you on your affair? Did you want Michael and Sarah to toast your new girlfriend? Did you want everyone here to pat you on the back for abandoning your wife when she needs you most?" The questions hung in the air like smoke, and I could see Frank realizing that he'd never actually thought past his dramatic announcement. He'd been so focused on his moment of liberation that he hadn't considered the consequences. "You know what, honey? That's when I made my own announcement. Folks," I said, taking the microphone one final time, "I want to thank you all for coming to celebrate Michael and Sarah's beautiful wedding. This wasn't how any of us expected the evening to go, but sometimes life throws curveballs that reveal people's true character." I looked directly at Frank when I said that, then turned back to the crowd with a smile that felt genuine for the first time all evening. Frank is absolutely right about one thing. We are getting divorced, but it's going to happen on my terms, in my timing, with lawyers who understand exactly what his financial situation really looks like. Y'all could hear the mischief dancing in my voice again because I was about to share one more little surprise. See, I've been consulting with a divorce attorney for the past 6 weeks, ever since I hired that private investigator to confirm my suspicions about Frank's behavior. And honey, Georgia is not a no-fault divorce state. Adultery matters here, especially when it's combined with financial fraud.
"Linda, sweetie," I called out to Frank's girlfriend, who was still hovering near the exit like she couldn't decide whether to run or stay. "You might want to think real hard about whether you want to tie your future to a man who's willing to publicly humiliate his wife of 42 years to get what he wants. Because, honey, if he'll do it to me, he'll do it to you too when someone younger comes along." Those words came out sweeter than pecan pie, but everyone in that room understood the warning underneath. That's when Frank finally found his voice again, but it was too late for damage control. "Dorothy, we can work this out. We don't need lawyers. We can handle this between ourselves like adults." And y'all, I almost laughed out loud at the audacity of that statement. Like announcing our divorce at our son's wedding reception was handling things like adults. Like having an affair for 18 months while stealing money from our joint accounts was mature communication. "Frank," I said, my voice dripping with all the sweetness I could muster, "we already tried handling things like adults. That's what I was doing when I kept quiet about your affair while I figured out how to protect myself and our children from the financial mess you've created. That's what I was doing when I didn't embarrass you in front of your golf buddies or your work associates or your brother and sister." I paused to look around that room at all those faces. But you chose a different approach. You chose public humiliation and manipulation and lies. So now we get to do this the hard way. Michael walked over to me and put his arm around my shoulders, and y'all, I felt something shift in that moment. My son wasn't just supporting me out of obligation or family loyalty. He was choosing me because he could see which parent had been acting with integrity and which one had been serving his own selfish interests. "Mom," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "you and Jessica and David always have a place with Sarah and me. Our home is your home, no matter what happens with Dad." That's when the tears really started, honey, but they were good tears, tears of relief and gratitude and love for the children who'd grown up to be good people despite having Frank for a father. Jessica and David, my other two children, came over to join the group hug, and suddenly I wasn't standing alone against Frank's betrayal anymore. I had my children, I had my new daughter-in-law, I had 200 people who'd witnessed Frank's true character, and I had the knowledge that I'd handled myself with dignity even when he hadn't shown me the same respect. Frank looked at our family circle, then at Linda, who was already halfway out the door, then at the crowd of guests who were no longer looking at him with sympathy or curiosity, but with something much closer to contempt. "This isn't over, Dorothy," he said, but his voice lacked the authority it had carried when he'd first grabbed that microphone. "You're absolutely right, Frank," I replied, my voice steady and strong. "This isn't over. It's just beginning. And honey, you have no idea what you've unleashed." I looked at him with the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the good cards in a poker game. "See you in court, sweetie. Bring your checkbook." What happened after Frank and Linda finally left the reception was something I'll never forget, y'all. The DJ, bless his heart, started playing music again, but instead of the dancing and celebration we'd originally planned, people came up to me in a steady stream. Old friends, distant relatives, people I barely knew, all wanting to tell me how impressed they were with how I'd handled myself, how sorry they were that Frank had put me in that position, and how they'd suspected something was wrong with our marriage but hadn't wanted to interfere. My book club ladies circled around me like protective sisters, telling me stories about their own divorces, their own cheating husbands, their own moments of standing up for themselves when they'd finally had enough. Frank's own family members came over to apologize for his behavior and assure me that their loyalty was with me, not him. After 42 years, I was as much family to them as Frank was, maybe more, because I'd been the one maintaining relationships and sending birthday cards and organizing holiday gatherings all those years. Even the wait staff and hotel employees kept finding excuses to come over and check on me, bringing me tissues and water and little words of encouragement. One young waitress, probably about the same age as Linda, whispered to me, "Ma'am, my mama went through something similar, and she always said the best revenge is living well. You're gonna be just fine." Y'all, the kindness of strangers and friends alike was overwhelming in the best possible way. But the most beautiful moment came when Michael and Sarah asked the DJ to play their first dance song again, "At Last" by Etta James, and invited me to dance with them. The three of us swayed together on that dance floor while 200 people clapped and cheered, and I realized that Frank's attempt to destroy the evening had actually created something more meaningful than a traditional wedding reception. It had shown my children and their friends what it looked like to stand up for yourself with grace, what it meant to choose integrity over convenience, and how family members should support each other when times get tough. As the evening wound down and people started leaving, person after person stopped to hug me and slip me their phone numbers, inviting me for coffee or dinner or girls' trips, promising to be there for whatever I needed in the coming months. Some of Frank's business associates even approached me quietly to let me know they'd be happy to serve as character witnesses if my divorce got contentious, because they'd seen how Frank had been treating me at company events and hadn't appreciated his complaints about our marriage. The last person to leave was Margaret, Frank's sister, who'd been crying on and off all evening. "Dorothy," she said, hugging me tight, "I'm so ashamed of my brother. The man who did that tonight isn't the Frank I grew up with, and I want you to know that Pete and I will be supporting you through this divorce, not him." She pulled back to look me in the eyes. "You've been nothing but good to our family for 42 years, and we're not going to forget that just because Frank has lost his damn mind." By the time Michael and Sarah and I were the only ones left in that reception hall, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, maybe years. I felt strong. I felt valued. I felt like Dorothy Johnson, not just Frank's wife or Michael's mother or anyone else's supporting character, but a woman who'd survived the worst betrayal of her life with her dignity intact and her family's love secure. "Mom," Michael said as we gathered up the last of the wedding gifts and flowers, "I'm sorry Dad ruined our wedding day. But honey, when I looked at my son and his beautiful new wife, I realized that Frank hadn't ruined anything that mattered. He had revealed his own character, yes, and he had created drama where there should have been celebration, but he hadn't damaged the love between Michael and Sarah. He hadn't destroyed the bonds between me and my children, and he hadn't taken away the joy of watching my baby boy start his own family. Sweetie," I told Michael, "your father didn't ruin your wedding day. He just showed everyone what kind of man he's become, and honestly, I'd rather know the truth than keep living a lie." I looked around that beautiful reception hall where I'd watched Frank destroy our marriage in front of everyone we knew, and I smiled. Besides, this way everyone knows exactly where they stand.
No more pretending, no more wondering, no more trying to keep up appearances for a marriage that was already over. The drive home that night was quiet but not uncomfortable. Jessica drove while Michael and Sarah and David and I sat in the back seat like we were kids going home from a family outing. Except this time, we were adults who just watched their patriarch reveal himself to be someone none of us recognized. When we pulled into the driveway of the house Frank and I had shared for 28 years, I looked at those familiar windows and realized that for the first time in months, I wasn't dreading walking through my own front door. Frank's truck wasn't in the driveway. He'd apparently gone straight to Linda's apartment after leaving the reception, and that was fine by me. I needed time to process what had happened, to call my lawyer, to start making practical plans for the next phase of my life. But first, I needed to get out of that pale blue mother of the groom dress and into my comfortable clothes, pour myself a glass of wine, and sit on my back porch to think about everything that had changed in the space of one devastating evening. As my children helped me carry wedding gifts and leftover flowers into the house, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about my future. Yes, I was about to go through a divorce at 70 years old. Yes, I was going to have to rebuild my financial security and my social life and my daily routines. Yes, I was facing the prospect of growing old alone after spending most of my adult life as half of a couple. But I was also free from the weight of Frank's lies and manipulation. I was free from wondering why my husband had become cold and distant. I was free from making excuses for his behavior to our children and friends. I was free from covering up his financial problems and emotional cruelty. And most importantly, I was surrounded by people who loved me unconditionally and respected me enough to stand by me when the going got tough. That night, after my children had gone home to their own families and I was finally alone in the house Frank had abandoned for his dental hygienist girlfriend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, really looked, not just a quick glance while brushing my teeth or fixing my hair. And I liked what I saw. I saw a woman who'd handled the worst day of her marriage with strength and grace.
I saw a mother who'd raised children who knew right from wrong and weren't afraid to stand up for it. I saw a person who'd been tested in front of 200 people and hadn't broken down or lashed out or embarrassed herself. The phone rang all evening. Friends calling to check on me, distant relatives who'd heard about the drama through the family grapevine, even some Frank's business associates wanting to make sure I was okay and offer their support. Every conversation reinforced what I'd realized at the reception. Frank's public betrayal hadn't isolated me or damaged my reputation. It had revealed how many people genuinely cared about me and had been quietly disapproving of how he'd been treating me for months. Around midnight, as I was finally getting ready for bed, I heard Frank's truck pull into the driveway. I watched from the bedroom window as he sat there for several minutes, probably gathering courage to come inside and face me after his spectacular performance at our son's wedding reception. When he finally came through the front door, I was waiting in the living room with a cup of tea and a manila folder full of documents my lawyer had prepared weeks earlier. "Dorothy," he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. After 42 years of marriage, I knew when Frank was about to launch into one of his justification speeches, and I wasn't interested in hearing why his behavior had been reasonable or necessary or somehow my fault. "Frank," I said, my voice calm and steady, "I have divorce papers for you to sign. I've also prepared a separation agreement that protects both of our interests while we work through the legal details." I slid the folder across the coffee table toward him. "You wanted out of our marriage so badly that you were willing to announce it at our son's wedding reception? Well, honey, you got your wish." He looked at those papers like they might bite him, then back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Fear mixed with respect, mixed with something that might have been regret. "Dorothy, I didn't mean for things to happen like that tonight. I thought it would be easier for me to tell everyone at once rather than having the same conversation over and over." I let out that bitter little laugh that had become my signature sound that evening. "Frank, you thought it would be easier for you. You didn't think about how it would feel for me to find out about your affair and your financial problems and your secret apartment hunting through a wedding reception microphone. You didn't think about how it would affect Michael and Sarah's special day. You didn't think about anyone but yourself, which honestly is pretty much how you've been operating for the last few years." The words came out matter-of-factly, without heat or anger, because I'd moved past the emotional devastation and into practical planning mode. Frank looked around our living room, at the photos of our children and grandchildren, at the furniture we picked out together over the decades, at the life we'd built that he was so eager to abandon, and I could see him finally understanding what he'd thrown away. "He never wanted to hurt you," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We both knew that wasn't true. You don't humiliate someone in front of 200 people by accident. You don't steal money from joint accounts without intending harm. You don't have an affair for 18 months while making your wife think she's losing her mind because something feels wrong in the marriage without wanting to inflict pain. "Frank," I said, closing my eyes for just a moment to gather my thoughts, "I don't care what you wanted. I care about what you did. And what you did tonight was unforgivable." When I opened my eyes, he was staring at those divorce papers like they represented some kind of betrayal on my part, as if I was the one breaking our marriage vows instead of simply responding to his abandonment. "These papers give you everything you said you wanted," I continued, my voice getting stronger with each word. "You get your freedom, you get to be with Linda, you get to start over with someone who doesn't know about your business failures and your tendency to blame other people for your problems." I leaned forward in my chair, looking him directly in the eyes. "But Frank, you also get the consequences of your choices. You get to explain to our grandchildren why Grandpa chose to leave Grandma for someone younger. You get to deal with the financial mess you've created without using my retirement funds to bail yourself out. You get to live with the knowledge that you destroyed 42 years of marriage in the most cruel way possible." He opened that manila folder and started reading through the papers, and y'all, I could see his face changing as he realized what he was looking at.
This wasn't some hastily thrown together revenge document. This was a comprehensive separation agreement that had been crafted by an attorney who understood exactly what Frank had been doing with our finances and our property. Every hidden bank account, every business debt he'd been concealing from me in the divorce, it was all laid out in black and white. "How long have you known?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "About Linda, about the money, about all of it?" "Long enough to protect myself," I replied, and honey, I let just a little bit of satisfaction creep into my voice.
Long enough to document your affair, trace the missing money, and make sure that when this marriage ended, and we both knew it was ending, Frank, I wouldn't be left holding the bag for your poor choices. I stood up from my chair and walked over to the mantelpiece where we kept our family photos. You thought you were so clever, planning your exit strategy and your new life while keeping me in the dark. But Frank, I've been married to you for 4 decades. I know when you're lying. That's when he finally showed some real emotion, not the calculated coldness of his wedding reception announcement, but genuine fear about what his future was going to look like. "Dorothy, some of these terms they're not fair. The house, the retirement accounts, the business assets, you're taking everything." I turned around to look at him, and y'all, I felt that mischief dancing in my voice again. "Frank, I'm taking what's legally mine under Georgia divorce law, especially in cases involving adultery and financial fraud. If you'd wanted to negotiate a friendlier settlement, you should have discussed divorce with me privately instead of announcing it to 200 wedding guests after stealing $50,000 from our joint accounts." I walked back over to my chair and sat down like I was settling in for a long conversation. "But here's the thing, honey. You don't get to control this process anymore. You gave up that right when you decided to humiliate me in public. The next hour was unlike any conversation we'd had in our entire marriage. Frank tried every manipulation tactic in his playbook. Guilt about our shared history, promises to make things right, threats about what he'd do if I didn't agree to more favorable terms, even attempts to blame me for driving him into Linda's arms through my supposed coldness and criticism. But y'all, something had changed in me that night at Michael's wedding. I'd found my voice and my strength, and I wasn't about to let Frank take them away from me again. "Sign the papers, Frank," I said when he'd exhausted his arguments and manipulations. "Sign them tonight, pack your things, and go live with Linda in whatever fantasy life you've constructed for yourselves. But understand this, our marriage is over, our friendship is over, and your ability to hurt me is over. You've lost your power over me, and honey, you're never getting it back." He signed those papers with shaking hands, probably realizing for the first time that his grand gesture of freedom was going to cost him far more than he'd anticipated. The house would be mine, along with most of the retirement accounts and all of the assets he'd been hiding. His failing business would be his problem to solve without access to my teacher's pension or my savings account. Linda would be getting a man who was essentially starting over at 72 years old, financially ruined and estranged from his children. After Frank left that night, for good this time, taking only a suitcase full of clothes and leaving everything else behind, I sat in my living room surrounded by 42 years of shared history and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: complete peace. No more wondering why my husband was acting strange. No more making excuses for his moods or his absences. No more trying to fix a marriage that had been broken by his selfishness and dishonesty. The next few months were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, financial reorganization, and social adjustment. Frank's business did indeed go bankrupt, leaving Linda with a boyfriend who couldn't even afford to take her out to dinner, let alone provide the comfortable retirement she'd been expecting. Several of his clients contacted me to express their disapproval of how he'd handled the divorce, and to offer their services if I ever needed home repairs or modifications. My children rallied around me in ways that made me proud of the people they'd become. Michael and Sarah insisted on having me over for Sunday dinner every week, creating new traditions that didn't include Frank. Jessica helped me learn how to manage the finances and legal matters I'd always left to my husband.
David, my youngest, appointed himself my escort to social events until I felt comfortable going alone. But the most surprising development was how my social life expanded once word got around about my divorce. Other women in similar situations reached out to share their stories and their support. I joined a book club specifically for divorced and widowed women, started taking art classes at the community center, and even began volunteering at a local literacy program where my teaching skills were appreciated and valued. 6 months after that devastating wedding reception, I ran into Linda at the grocery store, the same Kroger where Frank and I had shopped together for years. She looked tired and stressed, pushing a cart full of generic products when I was selecting organic produce and premium cuts of meat with my newly secure financial situation. When she saw me, she actually had the nerve to approach and try to apologize for her role in the destruction of my marriage. "Mrs. Johnson, I want you to know that I never meant for things to happen the way they did. Frank told me you two were separated, that the marriage had been over for years." Y'all, I looked at this woman who believed my husband's lies about our relationship and felt something unexpected, pity, not anger. "Linda, Frank told you what you wanted to hear, just like he told me what I wanted to hear for 42 years. The difference is I finally stopped believing him." I paused to really look at her. The stress lines around her eyes, the cheap clothes, the defeated posture of someone who'd realized their dreams weren't going to come true. "How are things working out for you and Frank?" I asked Linda. She looked down at her cart full of discount groceries and didn't answer directly, but I could see the truth in her expression. Frank, without my financial support and social connections, wasn't the prize she thought she was winning. He was just a broke, bitter old man who'd burned his bridges with his family and friends for an affair that was already showing cracks under the pressure of real-world problems. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Linda," I told her, and I meant it sincerely. She was young enough to start over, to learn from her mistakes, to find someone who would treat her with honesty and respect. Frank, on the other hand, was stuck with the consequences of his choices: financial ruin, estrangement from his children, and the knowledge that he'd thrown away a good marriage for an affair that was already failing. As I drove home from the grocery store that day, I realized that Frank's betrayal had actually been a gift, though not one I would have asked for. It had forced me to discover my own strength, to reconnect with my children in deeper ways, to build new friendships and pursue interests I'd neglected during my marriage. I was 70 years old and having experiences I'd never imagined. Traveling with my book club ladies, taking cooking classes, and even going on a few dates with men I met through church and community activities. The house that had felt so empty and sad after Frank left was now filled with the laughter of grandchildren who came to visit more often, friends who dropped by for coffee and conversation, and the sounds of my own projects and hobbies. I'd converted Frank's office into an art studio where I painted watercolors and wrote in journals, processing my experiences and planning my future. One evening, almost a year after that terrible wedding reception, Michael called to tell me that Sarah was pregnant. I was going to be a grandmother again.
"Mom," he said, his voice full of joy and excitement, "we want you to know that this baby will never know the grandfather who chose to leave his family, but they'll grow up hearing stories about the grandmother who stood up for herself with grace and dignity when life tried to knock her down." Y'all, that's when I finally cried the healing tears I'd been holding back for months. Not tears of sadness or regret, but tears of gratitude for the unexpected blessings that had come from the worst day of my marriage. My children respected me more now than they ever had when I was just Frank's supportive wife. My friendships were deeper and more meaningful. My future was full of possibilities I'd never considered while I was trying to hold together a marriage that had been dying for years. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 13 months after Frank's wedding reception announcement.
I wore my best navy blue suit and walked into that courthouse feeling like I was attending my own graduation ceremony rather than the legal dissolution of my marriage. When the judge pronounced us officially divorced, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. Frank was there with his lawyer, looking older and more defeated than I had ever seen him. Linda wasn't with him. Word through the family grapevine was that she'd already moved on to someone with better financial prospects. He tried to approach me in the courthouse hallway afterward, maybe to make some final plea or offer some belated apology. But I was surrounded by my children and my attorney and my book club ladies who come to support me on my big day. "Dorothy," he called out as I was leaving, but I didn't turn around. I'd said everything I needed to say to Frank Johnson at our son's wedding reception announcement. The man calling my name in that courthouse was a stranger who'd made his choices and would have to live with the consequences. I had my own life to live now, and it didn't include looking backward at the wreckage he created. That night, my children threw me a divorce party at Michael and Sarah's house. Not a celebration of my marriage ending, but a celebration of my new beginning. We ate cake, told stories about the funny moments from the past year, and talked about plans for the future. Jessica had made a photo album documenting my transformation from devastated wife to confident, independent woman, with pictures from my art classes, my book club trips, and my volunteer work. "Mom," David said during his toast, "watching you handle Dad's betrayal has taught all of us what real strength looks like. You didn't just survive what he did to you, you used it as an opportunity to become the person you were always meant to be." He raised his glass of sparkling cider. "Here's to Dorothy Johnson, not Frank's ex-wife, not even just our mom, but a woman who proved that it's never too late to stand up for yourself and start over." As I looked around that table at my children and their families, at the friends who'd become my chosen family, at the life I'd built from the ashes of Frank's betrayal, I realized something that would have shocked me a year ago. I was happier than I'd been in decades. Not because my marriage had ended, but because its ending had forced me to discover who Dorothy Johnson was when she wasn't defined by her relationship to someone else. The woman who stood in that Marriott reception hall and watched her husband destroy their marriage in front of 200 people was devastated and humiliated. The woman sitting at this dinner table a year later was confident, independent, and surrounded by love that was freely given rather than obligation or habit. Frank had thought he was taking everything from me when he left, but what he had actually done was give me back to myself. Y'all, I won't lie and say that every day of my new life has been easy. There have been lonely moments, financial worries, and times when I've grieved not just my marriage, but the future I'd planned with Frank. But those difficult days have been outnumbered by moments of joy, discovery, and satisfaction that I never experienced during my marriage. I've learned to do things I never thought I could manage, from changing light bulbs to managing investments to traveling alone to art museums in other cities. I made friends who like me for who I am rather than tolerating me as Frank's wife. I've pursued interests and hobbies that Frank had dismissed as silly or impractical. I've even started dating again, meeting men who treat me with the respect and kindness that I'd forgotten was possible in a relationship. The grandchild that Michael and Sarah were expecting turned out to be twins, a boy and a girl, who will grow up hearing stories about their Grandma Dorothy's courage and independence rather than cautionary tales about staying in bad relationships for the sake of appearances. When I hold those babies and see their perfect faces looking up at me with complete trust and love, I know that Frank's betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Frank had handled our marital problems differently, if he'd come to me privately to discuss his unhappiness instead of having an affair and making his dramatic announcement at our son's wedding reception. Would we have been able to save our marriage? Would therapy or counseling or simply honest communication have made a difference? But then I remember the Frank who stood up with that microphone, the Frank who was willing to steal money from our joint accounts and lie about his financial situation, the Frank who thought it was appropriate to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew rather than treating me with basic human decency. That wasn't a good man having a midlife crisis. That was a selfish person whose true character had finally been revealed when he thought he could get away with cruel behavior. The Frank I'd been married to for 42 years might have been worth fighting for. The Frank who announced our divorce at Michael's wedding reception announcement was not. And honey, recognizing the difference between those two versions of my husband was one of the most important realizations of my life. It freed me from the guilt of not trying harder to save our marriage and gave me permission to build something better for myself. As I finish telling you this story, y'all, I'm sitting on the back porch of my house now, legally and emotionally, watching the sunset and planning tomorrow's activities. I have lunch plans with my book club ladies, an art class in the afternoon, and dinner with a gentleman friend who makes me laugh and treats me like I'm the most interesting person in the room. It's a life I never could have imagined when I was standing in that reception hall watching my world fall apart. Frank got exactly what he said he wanted: freedom from our marriage and a chance to start over with someone new. But what he didn't anticipate was that his betrayal would also set me free from his lies and manipulation, free from the exhaustion of trying to fix problems I hadn't created, free to discover what Dorothy Johnson could accomplish when she wasn't spending all her energy supporting someone who didn't appreciate her efforts. The last I heard from Frank was he was working part-time at a hardware store, sharing a small apartment with a roommate because Linda moved on to greener pastures months ago. His relationship with our children is strained at best. They're polite when they have to interact with him, but the respect and affection they once had for their father died that night at Michael's wedding reception. He chose his selfish satisfaction over decades of family relationships, and now he's living with the loneliness that choice created.
I don't hate Frank. I've moved beyond anger to something much more powerful: indifference. He's simply not relevant to my life anymore, except as the father of my children and a cautionary tale about how selfishness and dishonesty eventually catch up with you. The woman who loved him, who would have done anything to save their marriage, who was willing to overlook his flaws and support his dreams, that woman died the night he grabbed that microphone and announced our divorce to 200 wedding guests. The woman who took her place is stronger, wiser, and infinitely happier. She knows her worth and won't accept less than she deserves. She's built a life filled with people who value her for who she is, not what she can do for them. She's discovered interests and talents that were neglected during 42 years of putting her husband's needs first. And most importantly, she's proven to herself and everyone around her that it's never too late to start over, to stand up for yourself, and to create a future that's better than the past you're leaving behind. So, honey, if you're listening to this story and recognizing something of your own situation in Frank's betrayal and my response, let me tell you what I wish someone had told me years earlier. You deserve better than someone who takes your loyalty for granted. You deserve honesty and respect and kindness in your relationships. You deserve to be with people who build you up rather than tear you down, who celebrate your successes rather than minimizing your accomplishments, who treat you as an equal partner rather than as someone whose feelings don't matter. And if someone in your life is treating you the way Frank treated me, lying, cheating, stealing, manipulating, and then trying to make you feel like you're the problem, you have more strength than you realize. You can survive their betrayal. You can rebuild your life, and you can find happiness that's deeper and more satisfying than anything you've lost.
It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight, but honey, it is absolutely possible. The woman who stood in that Marriott reception hall and heard her husband announce their divorce didn't know if she'd survived the humiliation and heartbreak. The woman telling you this story knows that surviving was just the first step. Thriving was what came next. And y'all, thriving is exactly what I plan to keep doing for whatever years I have left on this earth.